Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read Melissa V. Harris Perry's Sister Citizen. We are on page 144. This segment is entitled Emotional Effects, and it is in Chapter 4, Disaster. We are hardly surprised when victims of a disaster have profound emotional reactions. It is more remarkable when those who are not directly victimized experience negative emotional consequences simply as a result of their vicarious exposure to the vulnerability of others. Because Americans consumed many hours of visual Katrina coverage, the emotional effects of the disaster were not limited to immediate survivors. Just as race was directly implicated in how LeBlanc understood her experience, so, too, did Black and white Americans viewing the disaster from a distance have very different emotional responses to what they saw. The responses of African Americans were more pronounced than those of their white counterparts. The Pew Foundation survey conducted immediately after Katrina asked respondents, quote, "Have you yourself felt angry because of what happened in areas affected by the hurricane?" End quote. Although a significant proportion of whites, 46%, responded that they were angry, the feeling was much more prevalent among African Americans. 70% of Black respondents reported that the events surrounding Katrina made them angry. African Americans were also much more likely, 71%, than white respondents, 55%, to report that they, quote, felt depressed because of what's happened in areas affected by the hurricane, end quote. The Katrina study, on which I was a lead researcher, offers further insight into the racial and emotional reactions measured by Pew. Our survey was conducted approximately 1 month after the initial levee breaches. The Katrina disaster study, on which I was a lead researcher, offers further insight into the racial and emotional reactions measured by Pew. Our survey was conducted approximately 1 month after the initial levee breaches. We asked respondents, quote, "In the past 5 weeks since the Hurricane Katrina disaster, how often have you felt so sad that nothing could cheer you up, nervous, restless, or fidgety, hopeless, that everything was an effort, worthless, that difficulties were piling up so high you cannot overcome them, and that you are unable to control the important things in your life," end quote. For each emotion, respondents could report that they felt this very often, fairly often, not too often, hardly ever, or never. The results show consistent differences between African American and white respondents. Approximately twice the proportion of African Americans reported the highest level of each negative emotion. They were twice as likely to report being sad, nervous, restless, and hopeless, as well as to feel overwhelmed, worthless, and as though everything takes more effort. The most dramatic response is that the most dramatic response is that more than 1 in 10 African Americans reported very often feeling that they are unable to control the important things in their lives. These data suggest that the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina provoked different patterns of emotional response in Black and white Americans. Although all Americans reacted strongly, the impact seems to have been more deeply felt among African Americans. They also seem to have been somewhat more debilitated. When asked if their emotions in response to Katrina had interfered with life activities, 67% of whites reported that they have felt no impairment versus only 58% of Blacks. A full 42% of Black Americans reported that neither their negative emotions had interfered with their life or activities. For additional survey data, most of African Americans throughout the country had little reason to fear that their homes, neighborhoods, and city would be destroyed by a hurricane. So why were Black people more distressed than whites? It could be that Black people are generally more sad and anxious. There is some research suggesting that African Americans report chronically higher levels of emotional distress than whites do, but the evidence is mixed. In some studies, Black Americans report fewer symptoms of sadness. In other studies, the racial disparity in negative emotions disappears when you control for class. There is no clear, compelling evidence that Black people express chronically higher levels of negative emotion. But my analysis of data from the Katrina disaster study shows that when income, education, gender, and age are accounted for, race still has a strong and significant correlation with reported mental distress following this event. Is it possible that the post-Katrina emotional disparity is the result of African Americans always responding to national crises with more negative emotions than their white counterparts? The racial responses to September 11th suggest not. There was no meaningful gap in the emotional responses of Black and white Americans to September 11th, 2001. The only meaningful short-term difference in emotional responses is geographic. Residents of New York experienced more negative emotions, and follow-up studies revealed that New Yorkers were still experiencing emotional suffering 6 months after the attacks, when much of the country had begun to return to more normal psychological functioning. Proximity to the disaster left New Yorkers more shaken at the outset and more distressed in the long term. To the extent that there are differences in average emotional responses between Blacks and whites immediately following the attacks, it appears that whites, not Blacks, were more distressed. It is unlikely that we can explain the racial gap in the response to Katrina as part of a persistent racial pattern of response to disaster. Okay, let's have a reflection there. I think that the first thing that stands out to me from the passages we just read is the regularity within Sister Citizen that Melissa V. Harris Perry goes into the psychology that exists around stereotypes and the psychology that exists around race relations and the psychology that exists around shame, and not simply just from a statistical standpoint or from an economic standpoint, or even, again, not even just from an ideological standpoint, but from approaching it from a psychological standpoint, then even going into speaking about how that psychological aspect can have direct physical manifestations in a physiological aspect. And it's a good book to understand the damage, the mental health damage, or the mental health crisis that exists within the Black community specifically and uniquely with Black women, based on all of these psychological barriers that she's pointing out and bringing up. And so just to cite her approaching the psychological damages of Hurricane Katrina is something that I find very impactful. I believe the reason for the racial disparity and emotional response to Katrina lies not in the essential psychology of Black Americans, but in the racial dynamics voiced by Phyllis Montana LeBlanc. The explanation of why whites and Blacks feel so differently about Katrina lies in racialized beliefs about the failure of government to respond to the needs of African Americans. I saw this connection when I visited New Orleans in November 2005, just 7 weeks after the levee breach and long before I read LeBlanc's memoir. There I conducted dozens of interviews with survivors of the storm. I also attended several community meetings led by Mayor Ray Nagin and his Bring Back New Orleans Commission. The emotional devastation of those who had lived through the storm was palpable. Everyone I spoke with had been displaced following the city's mandatory evacuation. Most had sustained unimaginable loss of personal property. Many had survived the nightmarish conditions of the Superdome or Convention Center. Some were still searching for missing family members and friends. And a few had confirmed that family members had died during the storm. As survivors of the storm, they showed classic symptoms of post-traumatic shock disorder. I was not surprised to find people enduring painful and raw emotions, but I was stunned by the nearly universal agreement among African American survivors that their suffering was related to their status as second-class citizens. Most of Katrina's Black survivors echoed LeBlanc's belief that race explained their poor treatment in the storm's aftermath. The November 14th, 2005 meeting of Nagin's Bring Back New Orleans Commission was held in a large ballroom at the Sheraton Hotel in downtown New Orleans, which had become a kind of headquarters for municipal action. Mayor Nagin presided over the meeting, and the official panel included representatives from several federal agencies and local utility companies, as well as elected officials and community leaders. After an update on the state of the city and the pace of the recovery, members of the audience were allowed to come to a central microphone and address the panel. The first four persons who spoke were white residents from Uptown and Garden District areas with a variety of concerns about power outages, mold, and health issues. The fifth speaker was an African-American man who owned his own trucking business. As a local contractor, he expressed outrage that the, quote, storm followers, end quote, who were making, quote, $18 per hour while I can only manage to get $15 per hour, end quote. In an impassioned plea to the mayor, he shouted, quote, listen, I got 400 black men ready to work and we are being talked to like dogs. This is our city and we are being treated like second-class citizens, end quote. The audience broke into unrestrained applause. When the next African-American man spoke, he pleaded for a moment, quote, to pause and recognize the loss of thousands of people. The nation paused on 9/11, but not now. No one cares about our losses. I am a homeowner who is homeless. I am a taxpayer and a voter. I place my trust in the elected officials to do what is right, but instead we got nothing. We are not refugees. We are Americans, end quote. A black woman who had stood holding her sleeping toddler in her arms while listening to the first seven speakers continued the theme of government accountability. She said, quote, I was one of the people left behind. I was stuck on a roof in New Orleans East. I am a taxpayer and a registered voter. I am happy, but I am not rich. I have been shifted to 5 hotels all around the country. I am tired. I have never asked Louisiana for anything. I just want a place to call my own. I didn't need help before this. I was doing for myself and for my children. Mr. Mayor, all I want is a home for my children for Christmas, end quote. Then a black man who lost his home in the 9th Ward and was displaced first to Denver and then to Dallas confronted the mayor, saying, quote, what is really going on? You are asking us to come back to work? I served this city for 35 years and we are watching foreigners get paid to rebuild it while we are sitting on the curb. There is something going on, Mr. Mayor. I understand about the dollar bill situation, but I want to come back and function for my people, for New Orleans. It is wrong for us to be turned down. I was willing to stay an extra year to help my city. This is my home. These are my roots. We are not in Texas. We are here, end quote. Like Phyllis Montana LeBlanc, who yelled at the armed guards at Louis Armstrong Airport, quote, look at me, end quote. These African-American survivors were demanding recognition from their government. It is clear that Katrina survivors, as LeBlanc wrote, understood their experience in terms of citizenship. I wanted to know if other Black Americans, those not directly affected by the storm, were also experiencing negative emotions as a result of a sense of racial betrayal. Using data from the Katrina disaster study, I created a statistical model to determine if African Americans' negative emotions in the weeks following Katrina were related to their racial and political beliefs, and in particular, whether these emotions were linked to their feelings about slavery and Jim Crow. In the Katrina Disaster Study Survey, we asked a series of questions about support for federal reparations for African Americans as compensation for historic injustices. People in our study were asked, 1, do you think the federal government should or should not pay money to African Americans whose ancestors were slaves as compensation for that slavery? 2, do you think the federal government should or should not pay money to African Americans as compensation for the system of anti-Black violence and legal segregation known as Jim Crow? And 3, do you think that reparations should or should not be paid to survivors and their descendants of large, violent, 20th century anti-Black riots such as those that occurred in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Rosewood, Florida? The commas threw me off on that a little bit. These beliefs about reparations had a meaningful correlation with Black Americans' responses to Katrina. Even after we took into account such personal characteristics as age, income, and education, as well as other political views such as partisanship and strength of racial identification, those who support federal reparations for slavery, Jim Crow, and 20th century race riots felt worse in the weeks following Katrina. Remember, we did not ask people to predict the likelihood of reparations. Readers should not assume that the clear majority of Black respondents who believe the federal government should provide reparations are optimistic that it will provide them. Support for such remuneration. I ain't never seen that word before, or maybe I haven't. I just don't recognize it. Support for such remuneration is better understood as recognition of the lingering effect of racial injustice and government's failure to acknowledge or make amends for it. African Americans reported feeling greater levels of sadness and distress in the weeks following Katrina if they also believed that the federal government still owed Black Americans for centuries of previous injustices. Okay, here, let's take a second to reflect. We almost done with this section. Here, let's finish this section and then we'll take a second to reflect. LeBlanc thought of her enslaved ancestors as she endured the aftermath of Katrina, and her memory of their suffering provided a context for understanding her own. These data suggest that she was not alone in that comparison. The disparity between Black and white emotional responses to Katrina grows out of differing racial meanings given to the events. Those who believed the government owed reparation to Black Americans for prior racial injustices were especially distraught. The emotional disparity emerges because only a tiny fraction of whites, less than 10%, share African Americans' overwhelming belief, greater than 75%, that such reparations are justified. September 11th proved to be a rallying point of American identity. Americans largely shared a sense of vulnerability and loss in the days, weeks, and months following 9/11. Katrina did not provoke such a uniform emotional response. Black people found themselves relatively more isolated in their grief and fury. At the core of this differing response are the racial and political meanings that Black people assigned to the Katrina disaster. LeBlanc sums it up best. Quote, "When Hurricane Katrina blew on me, I folded. I still, to this day, can't believe that I crumbled that badly. It wasn't so much Katrina, but how nobody came to help us. And when they did, so many people had already drowned, and most in their own homes." End quote. And that brings us to a changing of the theme within this chapter. Looking to see how long the next section is. We might just call this an episode. Okay, yeah, I think what we're going to do here is just go ahead and end this episode. It'll be shorter than... Oh, no, okay. I think we can fit one more section in. Okay, so we're going to come back, read one more section. And I think my thoughts on the passages we just read was, again, just the importance of some of these social events that have happened in the 21st century, being able to identify the residual effects of them, and being able to identify how people from different intersections perceive these social events. And I think that goes a long way to understanding where we are in issues of race and where we are in issues of values, or how different people's value systems work, or how different people's ideology and beliefs work. And I think that one of the things that's needed for collectivism, which is what it's going to take to be able to deal with some of the issues of police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice, part of the collectivism is understanding other individuals' perspective on things and adding that understanding of perspectives into your belief in how to maneuver in our society and how to struggle against these issues. And so I think that these this social event, this historical event of Hurricane Katrina, does a good job of painting uh, the a unique perspective for us to grapple with. Policy consequences. Phyllis Montana LeBlanc is not the only African American who experienced emotional trauma following Katrina. The data I have just discussed is evidence that this emotional trauma stretched far beyond direct survivors of the disaster and extended to Black Americans throughout the country. Given that LeBlanc's emotional story represents the experience of many other Black Americans, what are the political consequences of this disaster of misrecognition? In the introduction to this book, I argued that Black women were Katrina's most visible victims. During the earliest days of disaster coverage, the suffering of women and children shifted media narratives away from law and order and toward outrage over the slow government response. Despite the role that Black women played in this shift, we have significant historical evidence, see Chapter 2, that American Black women are characterized by a number of negative stereotypes. Building on these findings, it is reasonable to ask if the visual representation of Katrina victims as Black women had meaningful social and political consequences. In short, does it matter differently to Black and white Americans if they think of Katrina as a storm primarily victimizing Black women? To answer this question, I turn to more data from the Katrina disaster study. This study included a randomized experiment to explore whether framing Katrina as a Black woman's disaster affected the ways that Americans responded to it. The design was straightforward. Each person who answered the survey was randomly assigned to one of the two images of storm victims. They saw either a, quote, Black mother, end quote, picture or a, quote, white family, end quote, picture. The Black mother image was taken from the cover of the September 12, 2001 issue of Newsweek, and the other appeared inside the same issue. Altogether, 251 Black Americans were assigned to the Black mother condition, while 236 were shown the white family image. Among white respondents, 345 viewed the Black mother image and 358 saw the white family. In addition to varying the picture, we varied the accompanying description. Half of our survey respondents received a description that included the word refugee, and half received a statement that included the word American. Thus, a survey respondent received a caption stating either, quote, more than 100,000 Americans were displaced from their homes as a result of the Katrina disaster, end quote, or, quote, more than 100,000 refugees were displaced from their homes as a result of the Katrina disaster, end quote. The, quote, refugee, end quote, and, quote, American, end quote, labels were meant to reinforce misrecognition of survivors as foreigners or to encourage recognition of these survivors as fellow citizens. As we saw from the statements of New Orleans at the Bring Back New Orleans meeting, quote, refugee, end quote, was humiliating and irritating as a label for many Black people who wanted media discussions of the storm to emphasize their American identity. This manipulation allows us to assess whether the word refugee encourages misrecognition. After giving our respondents one of the two images and captions, we asked them to choose between two statements. One, the federal government should spend whatever is necessary to rebuild the city and to restore refugees, Americans, to their homes. And two, although this is a great tragedy, the federal government must not commit too many funds to rebuilding until we know how we will pay for it. Regardless of the picture or caption study participants received, the results reveal a significant gap between Blacks and whites. Overall, 79% of African American respondents, but only 33% of white respondents believe that the government should spend whatever was necessary to rebuild New Orleans and restore victims to their homes. This difference existed regardless of the frame they were given. For African Americans, the desire to rebuild and restore was increased significantly by 8 to 14 percentage points when they saw the Black mother picture. The effect of the Black mother image was very different for white respondents. Not only did they display much weaker support for government spending overall, but the Black mother image made white respondents even less likely, by 2 to 6 percentage points, to respond that the federal government should spend whatever is necessary. Sorry about that. This effect was particularly strong for white respondents who were shown the black mother picture along with the word refugee. The likelihood of their supporting government spending fell up by 18, fell up. Okay, let me try that one more time. It's got this by up. It confused me a little. This effect was particularly strong for white respondents who were shown the black mother picture along with the word refugee. The likelihood of their supporting government spending fell by up to 8 percentage points. Although the total magnitude of the effect is small, there is a statistically significant impact on white attitudes. Together, these findings reveal that African American women were critical to the post-Katrina disaster experience. As they attempted to survive the storm and its aftermath, black women were often treated in ways that made them feel ashamed and dehumanized. They felt that because of their race, their government refused to acknowledge or respond to their needs as human beings and citizens. This survey shows through experimental manipulation that black women survivors elicited a less enthusiastic response from white Americans than white survivors did. When black women storm victims were framed as refugees, few white Americans felt a compelling need to spend collective resources to help them. Recall that even as infants, we feel shame when the powerful caregiver refuses to respond to us. It evokes a physical and emotional response rooted in humiliation and self-loathing. As a group, Black Americans experience Hurricane Katrina as a collective refusal by the powerful caregiver, the state, to see and recognize their needs. These racial misrecognitions had real effects. Tens of thousands of disaster victims were looking for shelter in the months following the storm. A study conducted by the National Fair Housing Alliance, NFHA, demonstrates that Black survivors encountered significant, demonstrable discrimination in their search for shelter. From mid-September until mid-December, the NFHA conducted testing in Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Tennessee, and Texas. They found that while white victims were given accurate information and were offered a break on rent because they had survived the storm, Black potential renters did not have phone messages returned, were not told about apartment availability, and were quoted higher prices for rent and security deposits. The NFHA findings are only one example of a broad pattern of racial bias that Black survivors encountered, but they are instructive because they reveal the prejudices these citizens encountered in the basic attempt to secure shelter. Misrecognition is not only about the emotional experience of rejection and humiliation, it also has material consequences. These lessons of Hurricane Katrina are applicable beyond incidents of natural calamity. To expand our understanding of race, gender, and shame as part of the experience of disaster, I turn to a very different event: the public discourse surrounding the accusation that members of the Duke lacrosse team committed rape. In this case, Black women began as powerfully mobilized public actors prepared to take action on behalf of another Black woman. By the time the case ended, they had become the objects of a public campaign to shame and silence them. That brings us to the changing of a theme within this chapter. What stands out to me from the passage that we just read from this chapter, entitled Disaster, is some of the manifestations of discrimination and prejudice and racism that Black people from New Orleans during this Hurricane Katrina crisis were experiencing were the same type of manifestations of racism and prejudice and discrimination that Black people have historically experienced, even outside of the context of this natural disaster. And so, for example, there was a time we've read in High Risers about the discrimination that Black people dealt with in their living conditions. There's a book called The Color of Law, which we will read at some point here, in which the same issue arises, or where they speak about the same issues of discrimination in housing. And one of the things that stands out to me about that book and about that discrimination that was going on is that in the Black neighborhoods during the 50s and 60s, 70s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, it would be a lot of times where Black people were paying more for substandard housing in neighborhoods that were slowly being conformed into ghettos by the city government, they were paying more for inadequate housing in those areas than white people were paying for the same type of home or the same type of uh, building in a nicer area. And so somebody would be living on the nicer side of town in a house or an apartment that was the same size that a black person on the worst side of town was living in. The white person on the nicer side of town in a home that's the same size would have a house that was kept up with better and that was in better condition and that had better schools in the area and better hospitals in the area and better chances for employment in the area. And then a black person would be, again, living in a house that the conditions were worse, the house was kept up with, or the apartment was kept up with, not as good as the white person's or the white people's house were. The schools in the area were not as good, were being ran down. The opportunity for employment in the area was not as lucrative, but they were paying more because of the fact that they were black. And so we see here that some of these people who were leaving Katrina, or who had to flee New Orleans because of Katrina, as they were looking for housing in other places, just simply being black was forcing them to be charged more, was making so that they had less opportunities to get that housing. And so we see again that, and this was something that was already spoken about before, but the storm was the great equalizer, and it no longer mattered how good of a job you had or how good of employment you had before the storm. Once the storm took place and occurred, and people were trying to find services for assistance, you were just black, and being black made it so that you were a second class citizen and you were second in line to the services that were needed of assistance during Katrina. And again, just the experiments that these survey experiments that were being conducted just does a good job of giving you a look behind the layer or behind the veil of the concept of a colorblind America. This concept that the race issue has been solved, or the race problem has been solved. And it just points out to you, these surveys just illustrate to you how much of our life in this country, in this society, is dictated by race, whether we like it or not. Okay, so we're going to end this episode here. I will encourage people to please share this episode on whatever platform you're listening to it on. Be on the lookout for tomorrow's episode of Rockford Reading Daily, where we will continue to read Melissa V. Harris Perry's Sister Citizen, and we will begin reading about the Duke Lacrosse case. All right, holla at you tomorrow.